This obelisk may ask us, can you expect to flourish forever? Can you expect wealth to accumulate and man not decay? Can it creep over you and yet the nation know no decrepitude? These are questions that may be answered in the time of the obelisk, but not in ours. A quote from U.S. Secretary of State William Maxwell Evarts, when Cleopatra's Needle, an obelisk in New York City, was raised. Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris.
And I'm Jen.
So we're back talking about Ouija, although we're taking kind of a bit of a detour today to talk about Egyptomania, which I think is tangentially related to Ouija. At least it's tangentially related enough to Ouija that I feel like we can talk about it. You know, Egyptomania is the Victorian obsession with all things Egyptian. And I think the reason why people were obsessed with Egyptian things, in large part, is because Victorian people were really obsessed with death. They were very morbid. They were interested in the supernatural, which is also why Victorian people were into Ouija, I think. So do you know much about Egyptomania?
No.
Or because I know we talked about, a few weeks ago, we talked about kind of like people grinding up mummies and taking it as medicine and that kind of thing.
That's so gross.
Before we kind of talk about what this is, why Victorian people were into it, and like some of the weird stuff that they did, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the racial components to Egyptomania. So first, there's some obvious imperialism involved in Europeans and Americans stealing artifacts from Egypt and displaying them and doing all kinds of awful things to them. But also, there's been a lot of scholarly work done that unpacks the racial implications of Egyptomania in the U.S. People in the U.S. definitely seem to see America as like a powerful empire, a lot like the Egyptian one. And there are parallels between Egypt and the U.S. in that they're both empires built on slavery. There's a big conflict about freeing slaves, the Civil War in the U.S. and beyond, Exodus in Egypt. And those are like really defining things in the culture. And there's a book about the topic called Egyptland by Scott Trafton. I just wanted to read a little bit from the summary of the book. So, the American mania for Egypt was directly related to anxieties over race and race-based slavery. The fascination with ancient Egypt among both Black and white Americans was manifest in a range of often contradictory ways. Both groups likened the power of the United States to that of the ancient Egyptian empire, yet both also identified with ancient Egypt's victims. As the land which represented the origins of races and nations, the power and folly of empires, despots holding people in bondage, and the exodus of the saved from the land of slavery, ancient Egypt was a uniquely useful trope for representing America's own conflicts and anxious aspirations. People in the 19th century were really aware of this parallel too. There's actually a Black 19th century doctor, writer, spiritualist, and Rosicrucian occultist named Pascal Beverly Randolph, who said in 1863, "For America, read Africa. For the United States, Egypt." And a lot of Black thinkers in the 19th century actually tried to show that Egyptians were Black Africans. That would have been a way to counter the racist and degrading history that the United States had imposed on African Americans. And I'm not super familiar with a lot of that theory, but I know that was a big conversation at the time. And then also, I think pretty much everybody knows about how enslaved African American people in the U.S. identified with Exodus in the Bible, singing spirituals like Go Down Moses, where Israel stood for the enslaved African Americans, and the Pharaoh represented the slave master. Of course, I guess it goes without saying that while all these Black thinkers in the 19th century were seeking to show that Egyptians were Black Africans, racist white scientists were trying to prove that ancient Egyptians were white. And there was a scientist named Thomas Pettigrew. Exactly, right? There's a scientist named Thomas Pettigrew, who we'll talk about later, who literally was measuring mummy skulls and was claiming that his measurements proved that they were Caucasian rather than African, which kind of ties into the whole history of phrenology, which is, a racist and debunked pseudoscience that was popular, among racists around this time. So this is a huge topic. And I'm not doing it justice, but I didn't want to launch into the topic of Egyptomania without touching on the large racial component of the interest in Egypt at the time, in addition to kind of what our focus is, which is kind of the morbid fascination that the Victorians had with death and kind of crumbling and lost empires, that sort of thing. So the whole reason why I got the idea to do an episode about Egyptomania as part of our Ouija series is that I came across a really interesting tidbit about the naming of the Ouija board. So I found a thread on Stack Exchange where someone had asked where did the name Ouija come from, and rather than kind of the histories of the name Ouija that we've talked about already, someone answered and said, oh, it might be from a type of charm that was called the Ouija, which is or maybe Ouija, Oudja. I guess Ouija is how you'd pronounce that. So they found an article from November 1885 about it, and it said that it was an Egyptian good luck charm. There were articles about the charm from, that persisted through 1891, and to quote a little bit from an 1891 article that they posted, the latest craze to strike Philadelphia is the wearing of the Ouija, a pretty little Egyptian charm supposed to ward off all forms of evil. The charm is thin and about 1 inch long and half an inch wide. A conspicuous figure is the Eye of Horus, which represents the sun, and a teardrop hanging pendant from the eyes that represents the River Nile. The little charm, which has been worn in England for a couple of years, has been indispensable to the superstitious Egyptians for many centuries. A pretty story explains the Egyptian craze. A young officer in the English army sent one home to his bride, with an explanation of its origin. After a battle in the Sudan, the young officer was reported dead, but his wife refused to believe it. Later on, the official dispatches confirmed the death, but the bride still had faith in the little charm. Several months later, the missing husband turned up alive and well, and the Ouija became a fad of great proportions.
Whoa.
I think that's really interesting, in part because when we were talking about Helen Peters and Ouija, she had been wearing a necklace that said, maybe Ouija, maybe Ouija. And I think this is just such an interesting synchronicity that someone's theorizing that, it's this other necklace that inspired the name. It's so strange to me.
Such a coincidence.
Mm-hmm. And, I'm not sure that I'm more convinced by this story than I am about the Helen Peters and Ouija one. But it's really interesting, and I hadn't seen it other places. And also, when I was kind of Googling stuff to do with the Ouija charm, I also saw that there's a large city in Morocco that's called Ouija or Ouija. It's Oujda, or it's also spelled Wejda. I'm very bad at pronouncing things, but it's not so different from the word Ouija.
Yeah.
So I also wonder if the name of the board was also either influenced by, there's this, major city in Morocco with a similar name, or if it was just part of the kind of exotic appeal of the board, where it's like, it sounds like it could be something Egyptian or Moroccan or whatever. So I just thought that was really interesting. As I started digging into that some more, I really went down the wormhole of Egyptomania because, the story about the bride with the necklace is very, Egyptomania.
Yeah.
And also I think that, the Ouija board's popularity, since it was marketed as an Egyptian luck board, part of it had to do with it seeming exotic and magical and people being interested in Egypt already.
Mm.
So to kind of set the stage, I wanted to define the Victorian period of history, since we've kind of talked about it without saying exactly when it is, when it started, when it ended, etc. So the Victorian era, it stretches the length of Queen Victoria's reign, so 1837 to 1901. And it's as we've talked about, it's a really weird historical period.
Mm.
So right before the Victorian era was the Georgian era, which was all about rationality and science. And that was 1714 to 1837. So it was during the reign of 4 kings named George. including King George III, who was like the king when America had its revolution. Jane Austen wrote during the Georgian era, so that's always my reference point for it.
Oh.
But also the Georgian era is like the time of enlightenment, and I'm like laughing looking at my notes, and I wrote, and other kind of boring sciencey advancements. So that really shows like my interest in weird morbid stuff over science, I guess. But there was like a sense of like science and reason and that sort of thing. So I kind of see the Victorian era as having gone off the rails a little bit. It's probably best known for being like buttoned up, repressed, religious, but there's also this new interest in the mysticism and the occult, or this increased interest in mysticism and the occult. So things got like pretty weird as the 19th century went on. So like Gothic literature became really popular again. Frankenstein had been written during the Georgian period, but the Victorian era brought books like Carmilla, which was a book about a lesbian vampire, which I don't know.
Cool.
I don't know. There's also, this is like a total side note. There's the book, which I haven't read, but there's a web series, like a modern reimagining of Carmilla called Carmilla that's very good and on YouTube that I recommend for anyone who, like me,
cool.
Tends to like to watch a web series over reading a book, apparently.
Yeah.
Also, there were books like Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There was Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and Dracula by Bram Stoker. So in America, you know, we had Edgar Allan Poe writing in the mid-19th century. So it feels kind of unavoidable that the morbid Victorians would get really into Egypt, which is, you know, ancient Egypt, which is a civilization that we know about because of their burials, basically, and their tombs.
Yeah.
So Gothic revival architecture, which started in the 1700s, really began to proliferate in the 19th and early 20th century. I found like one fun tidbit while researching this, which is that Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, got really into Egyptology in the 1880s, and he ended up corresponding with Oscar Wilde's father, Sir William Wilde, who was a noted cadaver collector.
What? A cadaver collector? Ooh.
Which, if that's not like a really Victorian story or fact, like Bram Stoker talking to Oscar Wilde's dad, who, of course, you know, like a normal British nobleman, liked to collect bodies.
Yeah, as you do.
You know. And kind of one Egyptomania related anecdote that I think really nicely illustrates the shift from the Georgian to Victorian era is a building that used to exist in London called Egyptian Hall. It stood in Piccadilly, and it was built in 1812 during the Georgian period. And, you know, it was a byproduct of this new interest in Egypt. And that interest began in part because in 1798, Lord Nelson, who was like this huge British hero, naval hero, he won the Battle of the Nile, which was one of the battles in the Napoleonic Wars. And then also, Napoleon himself stole a bunch of Egyptian artifacts and brought them back to Europe. So these artifacts became really popular among the European upper classes, and people started to become really interested in, you know, the exotic and mysterious Egyptian aesthetic.
Yeah.
So Egyptian Hall is one of those examples of people really getting into this aesthetic. So when you walked into the building, the entry hall was a replica of the avenue at Karnak, which was a temple complex in the ancient city of Thebes, near Luxor, which you might recognize for The Mummy Returns.
Yeah.
So they talk about Karnak in that.
That's most of my, like, I think Egyptomania references will probably be from The Mummy.
Yeah. And I think The Mummy and The Mummy Returns take place in the 1920s. So that's kind of the second big wave of people getting really obsessed with Egypt. Because, you know, King Tut's tomb was discovered in 1922. There was kind of this wave and then that wave, which I think we're probably all more familiar with because it's more recent.
Yeah.
So Egyptian Hall, like the facade, so the outside of the building, really exemplified the Egyptian revival style. It looked almost like an Egyptian temple. It had huge columns and sculptures of people on the front. And for a while, Egyptian Hall displayed natural history specimens from Captain Cook's voyages in the South Seas. And then later, relics from the Napoleonic War were displayed there. So then a little later, a man named Giovanni Battista Balzoni took over the building. There's a fun little tidbit from GeorgianLondon.com about him, who he sounds like a character. An Italian strongman and performer with an English wife, Sarah, Balzoni was a true adventurer. In 1817, he traveled to the Valley of the Kings and broke into the tomb of Seti I. From Seti's tomb, Balzoni took a sarcophagus of white alabaster inlaid with blue copper sulfate of great beauty. The retrieval of the sarcophagus, however, was not without peril. The tomb was located in the catacombs, a maze of traps and dead ends, dug to confuse grave robbers. The French interpreter panicked, and an Arab assistant broke his hip in a booby trap. Undeterred, Balzoni retrieved the sarcophagus and brought it to England along with the head of the younger Memnon. Balzoni suffered constant vomiting and nosebleeds in Egypt, while Sarah was unaffected by so much as a case of sunburn, much to her husband's chagrin. Which I thought was very fun. A fun little detail.
Yeah.
And also I like that this sounds like Indiana Jones or something, you know?
It does, yeah. The booby traps and everything.
Right? So in 1846, things got a little weirder at Egyptian Hall. There was a really creepy exhibit of a talking machine, which was an automaton of a lady's head attached to a big machine on top of a piano.
What?
And she had dark hair in ringlets and eyes that didn't blink.
Ugh.
Her name was Euphonia, which I think means like good sound or something. And she could say, "Please excuse my slow pronunciation. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a warm day. It is a rainy day. Buongiorno, signori." So it's kind of like a weird, creepy automaton.
Yeah.
And the inventor was a mad scientist type who was described like this by a man who knew him. The professor was not too clean, and his hair and beard sadly wanted the attention of a barber. I have no doubt that he slept in the same room as his figure, his scientific Frankenstein monster, and I felt the secret influence of an idea that the two were destined to live and die together. One keyboard, touched by the professor, produced words which, slowly and deliberately, in a hoarse, sepulchral voice, came from the mouth of the figure, as if from the depths of a tomb.
Ooh.
So,
It's
very
creepy.
Victorian, very creepy.
Yeah.
I love the mad scientist element.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
You know, he's sleeping in the same room as his creation. This person imagines.
Yeah.
So then by 1873, you know, really deep into the Victorian era, the Egyptian Hall had become less respectable. It became known as England's home of mystery, and a man named John Neville Maskelyne, I think that's how you say his name, a magician and inventor, performed there for 31 years.
Whoa.
And his story is interesting because he got into stage magic because he saw some fraudulent spiritualists perform, and he realized that he could make all of this supposedly magic things happen without any actual magic. He invented several illusions that are still used by magicians today, including some stuff to do with levitation. And he ran in the same circles as Harry Houdini, which makes sense since they were both magicians trying to disprove spiritualism as a fraud.
Yeah.
He wrote a book called Modern Spiritualism. He later founded a group called the Occult Committee to investigate the paranormal and disprove it. He also invented the pay toilet.
That's so random.
So random. I was like, wait, one of these things is not like the other. And there was kind of an interesting quote from him. So, you know, he was trying to disprove spiritualism, but he once said, "The spiritualists had no alternative but to claim us as the most powerful spirit mediums who found it more profitable to deny the assistance of spirits." So basically, like, you know, he was working to say that spiritualism wasn't real. And so the spiritualists were like, oh no, all the things he's doing is magic, or, you know, is real spiritualism. He just finds it more profitable to say it's not.
So they're just rationalizing it for themselves.
Yeah. So basically by the 1890s, the Egyptian Hall was really strongly associated with spiritualism and the occult. So, it started out as an exhibit of scientific specimens from, a sea voyage. Then it became just all magic tricks, spiritualism, creepy automatons. And that to me is like the perfect encapsulation of at least my understanding of the Georgian period into the Victorian period, right?
Yeah.
I mentioned, we were talking about Egyptian stuff a few weeks ago, and, the Victorian obsession with Egypt, and I had said, oh, they ground up mummies and used them as medicine. I was actually slightly wrong about that, in that it was not a Victorian thing. It was earlier than the Victorian era that people started doing that. So it's possible that people started grinding up mummies and using them as medicine as early as 1100 or 1300 AD or CE. A lot longer ago than I thought.
Wow.
A side note here, we're talking about cannibalism, right? Like people eating powdered corpses.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of funny-ish stuff coming up in that, what are these ridiculous people doing? Why are they doing this, etc.? But I just want to take a sec to say that, and to also say all of this Egyptomania is tied to something that's, I think, is worse than cannibalism, which is, just like plundering another culture and then taking its history literally right down to the bodies of their ancestors and commodifying them.
Yeah.
It's so easy to kind of forget that because, the stories we're telling here are really weird, really dark, and it's hard not to kind of laugh at how absurd they are. And I'm sure we're going to laugh because the stuff is bizarre, and the Europeans and Americans who partook in this Egyptomania were foolish and ridiculous. But just wanted to, take a quick breather to reflect on how we're talking about white people plundering a culture and history, etc.
Yeah.
But with that caveat aside, I do want to talk a little bit about the use of powdered mummy as a medical remedy, because it's very strange. So it sounds like it was an item that was sold to Christians, particularly European Christians, and it became very popular in the 16th and 17th centuries. So apparently at one point, every apothecary, supposedly, carried it as a treatment for cuts and bruises. So people broke into tombs and stole mummies. Some people also made fake mummies because, there's only so many mummies, and robbing a tomb is harder than finding a fresh body. So people would use the bodies of executed criminals and slaves, or people who've died from all different diseases, and they'd basically mummify them and then sell them to people as if they were ancient mummies.
Oh my god.
Yeah. And also think about, for a sec, so they were also using the bodies of people who died from diseases, grinding them up, and then saying, here, this is healthy. It'll cure your disease.
Oh god, that's so messed up.
Yeah. They also used the bodies of people who had died while traveling in the desert because the dry desert air, desiccated their bodies, so basically mummified them. And supposedly the bodies of young women were supposed to work better for medicinal purposes, so they were more expensive. So King Francis I of France, who was a king in the 1500s, carried around a pouch of powdered mummy mixed with rhubarb, and then anytime he tripped or fell or hurt himself, he took some mummy.
Ugh.
For health.
Oh my god.
There's so many things that don't make sense about that, but also,
No.
I guess it made sense based on medical science of the 1500s.
How did they take it? Did they, eat it or, mix it with drinks?
I think they, took a pinch of it, was the image that I had, but it's very possible that they could have mixed it with drinks or whatever.
Snorted it or something.
Right?
Mixed it in, Metamucil.
Yeah. And so I got most of this information from a 19th century book called A History of Egyptian Mummies from Thomas Pettigrew, that racist scientist who's kind of tied into a lot of the stories about mummies in this era. But so based on what he wrote, it sounds like people in the 19th century weren't really into taking mummies as medicine anymore. But they were still, of course, obsessed with Egypt. And this book that he wrote kind of made him a very sought-after authority on Egypt. So one thing people were obsessed with in the Victorian era was Egyptian-themed mourning jewelry. So women would wear jewelry with real dried scarab beetles
Ooh.
or with Egyptian imagery like obelisks. The Egyptian revival style, the architectural style, became really popular in cemeteries. So Highgate Cemetery in London has a huge gate done in that style, as does Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston, Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven, Connecticut. If you go to Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery, you can see an Egyptian revival mausoleum there. That's
I
very
did see that
popular.
a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
I saw that.
Yeah. Did you know it was there before you went?
No, but like it's in like a very prominent spot, like on a corner. So when we're walking up the hill, and I was like, "Is that a pyramid?"
Yes, it is. I'm trying to remember. Is there a sphinx outside of it too?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
two sphinxes or
And
something?
then there's some weird like Christian imagery mixed in of like Jesus and Mary and stuff.
Right.
So it's like very odd.
Super weird, but very of this time.
Yeah.
There were also, of course, like non-cemetery Egyptian revival structures that were really big at the time. So, of course, probably the most famous one is the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. That's the big obelisk there. That was erected during this period. There were also several large Egyptian revival buildings in New York City that have since been torn down. One of them is the original 1838 version of the Manhattan Detention Complex, which I've always heard referred to as the Tombs. And I actually never realized why it was called the Tombs. I always thought it was because prisoners would be sent there and then never leave.
Yeah.
It's where prisoners go to wait for hearings. But actually, the reason why it's called the Tombs is because the original one that stood there, the original building that stood there, was an Egyptian revival structure, and it looked kind of like a tomb.
Oh my god.
Yeah, like an Egyptian tomb.
Yeah.
But the architect had been inspired by a recently published travelogue that had an etching of an Egyptian tomb. So he was like, oh, great. Inspiration for this prison.
Oh my god.
That's not gruesome at all.
No.
So
Wait.
this was in downtown Manhattan, kind of like financial district. They started building this Egyptian revival prison. Construction hit a little bit of a snag because the location where they were building it was a filled-in pond. And from the surface, it looked fine because, it had been filled in, etc. But just below the surface was quicksand.
Oh.
So they kept trying to build it, but it was like quicksand. So they had to make the foundation out of they basically made a raft that would rise and fall with the quicksand, which moved with the tides. So already this building, it has some issues. It had very few windows for exterior aesthetic reasons. I guess because Egyptian tombs didn't have windows. So there was so little light inside that the interior had to be lit by gas lights, even during the day, which is very gloomy sounding.
Yeah.
The building itself was really gloomy and dark. Charles Dickens said of it, "What is this dismal-fronted pile of bastard Egyptian, like an enchanter's palace in a melodrama? Such indecent and disgusting dungeons as these cells would bring disgrace upon the most despotic empire in the world."
Whoa.
So that's strong words from Dickens.
Yes, you didn't like that.
No. Of course, the building looked beautiful from the outside, but apparently inside it was like, a lot of people considered it the worst prison in New York. I feel like some of the Roosevelt Island, or, at the time Blackwell's Island prisons could give it a run for its money, but, they're both bad, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
So the building was declared unsafe eventually, and a couple of decades after it was declared unsafe, they demolished it in 1897. So, right before they tore it down, the New York Times called it the finest specimen of purely Egyptian architecture to be found in the United States. It does sound like it was the largest Egyptian revival building like that, of its type. They considered relocating it to Central Park and repurposing it, but they were like, no, that plan's way too expensive. This part is pretty sad to me. In the end, no part of the building, which had a lot of beautiful details like winged scarabs, beautiful columns, and just other cool, unique Egyptian revival details, was preserved. It was all destroyed.
Wow.
It's just sad. It's they couldn't have kept one little statue.
Yeah.
So then the other now forgotten Egyptian revival structure in New York City, which is something I think about all the time and may or may not have already told you about, is the Croton Reservoir. which it stood where Bryant Park is now. So, like, now there's Bryant Park and the New York Public Library, like the famous building. But in the 19th century, there was the Croton Reservoir. So when we talked about the Renwick Smallpox Hospital, we discussed how James Renwick Jr., the architect of the Smallpox Hospital, as well as some of the more famous New York City buildings like St. Patrick's Cathedral, he worked on the Croton Aqueduct, which was constructed to bring clean water to the city. So specifically, he designed the reservoir, which was in the Egyptian Revival style. The aqueduct brought water from upstate New York, where it was stored in the reservoir and then distributed all around the city. So before that, there had been some really bad outbreaks of yellow fever and cholera because there wasn't safe drinking water. So this was like a really big improvement to the quality of life in New York. So the reservoir sat on 4 acres of land. It held 20 million gallons of water, and it was built of these huge granite blocks. It started distributing water in October of 1842. And one cool thing is once it opened, people could actually visit it and go for walks. You could go up these stairs and go for walks around a promenade that was on the top, like around the edge of the reservoir. Oh. So it was like a big weekend destination. People would go for a stroll there. I guess on top of the reservoir, you had a really clear view of the East River, the Hudson, and the Palisades in New Jersey. It sounds really beautiful. I feel like I think about this reservoir pretty often ever since I found out about it 10 years ago or whatever, just because it's every engraving of it and picture of it looks so cool. It's such a weird, this huge Egyptian structure in the middle of on Fifth Avenue.
Wow.
So when the reservoir was first built, there weren't that many buildings around it. But by the 1850s, it was surrounded by brownstones. People were really put off by it because it had, the huge dark gray walls. And it was a really striking building, but not the most friendly one. So they tried to soften up its appearance by planting some ivy on it. That'll do it. Just put a plant on it. It'll look totally different. So after a few decades of people complaining about the reservoir, it was demolished in 1898. So 1 year after the tombs were demolished. They'd built more reservoirs in the meantime, so they didn't really need this one as much anymore. And people seemed to really hate it aesthetically. They demolished it, and they said it would probably cost about $100,000 to demolish it, which is more than $3 million today.
Whoa.
Just because the blocks were so huge and it was so solidly constructed.
Yeah.
So there's almost no trace of it today, but if you go to the New York Public Library, the famous building that's there in Bryant Park, I think in the basement you can still see some of the stone granite, the foundation, I guess, of the old reservoir. I've seen pictures of it. It's there's a staircase, and through the staircase you can see these granite stones, and that's left over from the reservoir. But that's kind of all that's left. Egyptian revival structures were a lot more popular in other cities than New York, like Baltimore. It caught on a little bit more. But for whatever reason, it seems like New Yorkers found it really aesthetically displeasing after that initial craze. Because there kind of don't seem to be that many left, at least from the 19th century. So then, in addition to building Egyptian revival structures, people in this time period would actually, there were actual ancient Egyptian artifacts in major cities, most notably obelisks. So there's these 3 obelisks that are all called Cleopatra's Needle. One's in London, one's in Paris, and one's in New York City. All 3 of them were about 1,000 years old when Cleopatra was alive, so their name's a total misnomer, but they are ancient Egyptian obelisks. All 3 were gifts from the Egyptian government during the 19th century. I had only known about the New York City one, which is in Central Park right by the Met. For whatever reason, I hadn't realized it was a real ancient obelisk. I think I just assumed it was a replica.
Yeah.
But when I looked it up, I found out it was real and ancient, and then there were the 2 others. I think it says a lot about the history of European relations with places like Egypt. All 3 obelisks were gifts from someone named Muhammad Ali Pasha, who was an Albanian Ottoman governor who basically ruled Egypt from 1805 to 1848. He had been sent from the Ottoman Empire to take Egypt back from Napoleon. And then once Napoleon's troops left, he was able to get into the position of viceroy. And then he ended up getting control of parts of Arabia, Upper and Lower Egypt, Sudan, the Levant, which is like modern day Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, a bunch of Turkey, Israel, I think some parts of Greece. So he ended up ruling a lot of that part of the world. The obelisk in Paris is one of the two 3,000-year-old obelisks that once stood at Luxor Temple in Egypt. The other one's still at Luxor. The reason why I go into like all this detail about who was ruling Egypt at the time is because he was basically like a conqueror who took over Egypt. He was not Egyptian. It's not like the obelisks were gifts from the Egyptian people or something.
Yeah.
For the obelisk in Paris, France was supposed to give him a French mechanical clock in exchange, which seems like a terrible trade. I feel like that's only a good trade if you don't have have respect for the culture that had this 3,000-year-old artifact at this temple.
Yeah.
This like ancient temple. Like obelisk, clock. So after the obelisk had already been delivered to France, they, in Egypt, discovered that the mechanical clock that France had sent didn't even work. Which is so typical.
Yeah.
So it might have been damaged in transit. Like, it's not necessarily that they sent over a faulty clock, but it sounds like it didn't work, and it sounds like they never got it to work. So today, that clock is still in Egypt. It sits in a clock tower in Cairo, and it still doesn't work.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's 21 ancient obelisks that are still standing in the world.
Yeah.
Of those, Egypt has fewer than 5.
Wow.
Rome has 13, which were all taken during the time of the Roman Empire. And then the rest are kind of scattered around, like between New York and Istanbul, basically. So it's really sad to me that, like, Egypt has so few obelisks still. And, we were talking about Muhammad Ali Pasha and how he ended up ruling Egypt for a long time. And, he was not Egyptian, obviously. The dynasty that he set up ended up running Egypt until the revolution of 1952. So for 150 years, Egypt was basically ruled by, like, his dynasty. It really sucks that so many Egyptian artifacts ended up being taken out of Egypt.
Yeah.
This didn't just happen in Egypt, of course. Like, a ton of countries had their culture plundered by Europeans and Americans. I think the obelisk thing is upsetting, but to me, like, the most upsetting thing is people taking Egyptian mummies and, like, some of the stuff that people in the 19th century did to them.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, mummy unwrappings became, like, a popular thing. So in England, that surgeon, Thomas Pettigrew, who we don't like, would host parties where people would come watch mummies be unraveled.
Oh my god.
Yeah. He'd unwrap the mummy and then saw off part of their head and then prop up the mummy like they were still alive and try to scare people.
Oh my god. That's awful.
Yeah. What's interesting to me, like, we're talking so much about, like, Ouija and stuff. It's interesting, too, how, like, Ouija was a parlor game, right? It was, like, a fun trick. This guy turned mummies into a parlor game, basically, right?
Yeah.
Like, into, like, a thing to have at parties. I guess Pettigrew did 40 mummy unwrappings, which is a lot. I find him really detestable. In addition to trying to prove that, the ancient Egyptians were white, and in addition to commodifying the bodies of dead ancient Egyptians, he also did things like he displayed the severed mummified head of an indigenous Australian named Yagan, Yagan. I may be mispronouncing that. Yagan was a guy who had opposed colonial rule. He was indigenous, and of course he was killed by bounty hunters in Australia. Pettigrew got the rights to use his head for 18 months.
Oh
which,
my god.
That raises a lot of questions, right? It's like, wait, you can get the rights to a head? Like, you can, like, rent an indigenous person's head?
Oh, god.
It gets worse. He adorned his head with cockatoo feathers and a headband. And then he would display the head in front of a painting that showed the colonizers and the indigenous people of Australia living together in harmony. Which just... that just, like, makes my blood boil.
That is not what happened.
No. And literally, he is evidence. Like, this person who had fought for his people's rights and then been killed for it is now, like, being used as this, like, party trick, prop.
Entertainment.
Yeah. Ugh. To promote a narrative that opposes everything he stood for.
Yeah.
You know?
White people suck.
Yeah. This Egyptomania stuff, like, it's fun to laugh at the Victorian people doing ridiculous things, but also, like, the more you dig into this, the more you're like...
Yeah, it gets really dark really quickly.
Yeah. In the 19th century, Europeans had started traveling to Egypt pretty frequently, and in 1833, there was a French aristocrat and monk who said, "It would hardly be respectable, on one's return from Egypt, to present oneself without a mummy in one hand and a crocodile in the other."
Oh, mummy and crocodile. The two essentials you need when you come back from Egypt.
Gotta get your souvenirs.
Yeah, right.
And so supposedly what would happen is a few weeks after a traveler came back from Egypt, they'd come back with their mummy, and then they'd invite their friends over for a mummy unwrapping. They'd have dinner and drinks, and then unwrap the mummy afterwards.
Oh my god.
I guess the unwrapping would understandably smell pretty bad.
Yeah.
But, like, maybe people were drunk enough to not care. This is obviously a thing that rich people did most often, since they were the ones who had money to go to Egypt, or who had friends who went to Egypt. But sometimes there were more public mummy unwrappings for the general public to see. Though there are, like, a lot of experts who say that mummy unwrappings weren't as popular as people say they were, and that it was mostly done by scholars. As far as I've been able to confirm, looking at old newspapers, that seems to be mostly correct. I have been seeing more articles about mummy unwrappings as scientific or academic events. I haven't been seeing, like, write-ups in society columns about a mummy unwrapping party. Mm-hmm. A lot of the articles I find about Ouija come from society columns, so it's not above people to write about a really mundane party where, like, they happen to be playing with a Ouija board. So I feel like there would be a lot of articles about this in society columns if it really was a huge thing. But I found one article from 1850 that talked about how there were supposedly 8 to 10 million mummies in Thebes. It talked about how anyone could travel to Egypt and then bring back a mummy. And the article said, "The open doors of the tombs are seen in long ranges and at different elevations, and on the plain, large pits have been opened in which have been found 1,000 mummies at a time."
Whoa.
I don't know how true this is, but this article is kind of claiming, like, oh, just go to Egypt, get a mummy, they have tons of them, bring it back, whatever. I don't know. It's hard to say how much of that is, like, real.
Yeah.
Though, obviously, you know, some people were bringing back mummies. I also wonder how many of the mummies that people brought back were, like, real ancient Egyptian mummies, and how many of them were, you know, fake mummies made from people who died more recently.
Yeah.
But it sounds like as the 19th century wore on, the scientific community started to push to preserve mummies for research purposes. So I found an article from 1881 that described some American tourists finding an Egyptian princess's tomb. And there's just a throwaway line that says that the mummy, quote, "like most of the treasures of antiquarian Egypt, was after a while carted away to the British Museum." That's kind of just a throwaway line that shows, you know, oh yeah, you know, the British just take everything.
Yeah.
Which definitely, I remember studying in art history class, controversies about, you know, different items that the British Museum has. And there's also some big controversies about some stuff that the Met has in New York.
Yeah, yeah. The Met has a ton of Egyptian, like, artifacts. Like, a ton.
The Met has a lot of problems, like, not least of which, you know, the Egyptian wing is called the Sackler wing, and the Sackler family, you could say, is responsible in large part for the opioid crisis in America.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, they have a lot of Egyptian stuff. They have, I'm probably going to slightly misremember this, but I think what we studied were different artifacts from antiquity, not necessarily the Egyptian ones. And I think that the idea was that they had been purchased on the black market by this couple, I'm blinking on their name, and that potentially, you know, they were basically stolen from these cultures they were not supposed to be stolen from, and purchased on the black market and then donated to the Met. All of this, I guess, is alleged.
It would kind of, you know, fit with everything else white people have done, though.
Exactly. And, like, if I'm remembering correctly, these artifacts are, like, not that... This part wasn't that long ago, like, you know, the stuff I'm talking about with the Met.
Yeah.
I think it was, you know, in the 20th century.
Yeah, yeah. So they were just like grave robbing this princess's tomb.
Right.
Just
Yeah.
like took it and just like didn't even care.
Mm-hmm.
Ugh.
Yeah, they took it, and then it sounds like they talked to some kind of authority who were like, "Oh yeah, got the mummy, got to bring it back to England."
Yeah.
Maybe that mummy was examined in a scientific way. You know, I mean, it must have been if it ended up in the British Museum, but it was still like stolen by a partying American tourist. I think that the article called them American pleasure seekers. Breaking into a tomb.
Worst kind of American.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I wanted to read a little bit from some articles that did describe mummy unwrappings, just so you can kind of get a taste of how people were talking about it and what was involved.
Mm-hmm.
I found an article from the New York Star in 1838 that seemed to have been reprinted fairly widely, called Antiquities from Egypt. An interesting scene lately took place at the Anatomical Theater of the Washington Medical College at Baltimore. It was the unwrapping of an Egyptian mummy from Memphis, presented by Commodore Elliot of the Navy. The usual transverse wrapping of the coarse muslin externally and longitudinal wrapping of fine next to the shriveled embalmed body were observed. A skull in great preservation, not embalmed, and dug up by the Commodore himself, was also presented. So then the article goes through kind of a laundry list of a bunch of other artifacts that were also shown then. And then I found an article from August 1894 that mentions that as the 19th century wore on, it was harder to get mummies to unwrap. So the headline is, "Hark from the Tombs, a relic from Egypt, 3,000 years old. Unwrapping a mummy by the Scientific Society, recently came from Egypt and was the gift of Mrs. P.T. Barnum." Headlines were really long back then.
P.T. Barnum.
Yeah. So, of late years, quote, "the spoiling of the Egyptians has been prevented by the government of that country as much as possible, and it has been constantly more and more difficult to procure for scientific purposes specimens of the ancient Egyptian embalming art, and therefore the presentation to the Scientific Society of this city of a very fine mummy from Egypt by Mrs. P.T. Barnum was an event not to be lightly passed over. How Mrs. Barnum procured it is not known exactly, but through some office of the American consul at Cairo or Alexandria, doubtless it was done." So, like, it's nice to hear that Egypt was trying to reduce the number of mummies that were leaving the country.
Yeah.
Even though, you know, it was maybe a little late for that. But also the tone of the article is like, it's so obnoxious that Egypt isn't letting us steal all of their ancestors.
Dare they try to stop us from destroying their history.
Yeah.
How dare they?
Right? It's now so hard to have our mummy unwrapping parties.
Yeah.
And I also like that coy note where it's kind of like, oh, well, you know, we don't know how she got it, but probably she went to the American consul.
Yeah.
And it's like...
probably through the correct way of doing it.
Right?
Doubt it.
I'm sure it wasn't stolen, smuggled, anything like that.
Definitely not.
Nope. So the interest in Egyptian beliefs about death, you know, were so popular, you know, in the 19th century that in 1852, the 10th Duke of Hamilton insisted on being buried in the Egyptian style. He was mummified, then placed into an actual ancient Egyptian sarcophagus, which had once housed a princess whose name has been forgotten.
Oh my god. So he was, like, didn't even get his own sarcophagus, like, made. He used someone else's.
Just, like, basically so dump out the body, use a new one.
And now that no one knows who that princess was. Oh my god.
And he bought the sarcophagus, like, 30 years before he died, and he had it carved out on the inside to fit his body, because obviously, like, he was larger than this Egyptian princess. And then he was put in a Roman-style tomb at his estate in Scotland.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Ugh. That's so gross.
Yeah, and part of the interest in Egyptian, like, funeral rites and stuff had been spurred by, in the 1840s, the Egyptian Book of the Dead had been translated into English. So that was, like, the first modern translation. And, you know, the Book of the Dead unlike in The Mummy Returns, or The Mummy, I don't remember which one it is about the Book of the Dead, maybe both. Yeah. It doesn't bring mummies back to life.
It doesn't?
It doesn't do anything sinister. It just details different beliefs that the ancient Egyptians had about death and the afterlife. So, in part, like, because of, you know, this new information about Egyptian burials and funerary rites, different occult groups started to get really interested in Egypt. So, like, the Masons, the Order of the Golden Dawn, all these groups ended up adopting different kind of Egyptian, in huge quotation marks, practices. Mm-hmm. I feel like when they say that it's an Egyptian practice, it's actually like a totally made up ritual and someone's wearing a silly looking like headdress that looks like something a pharaoh would wear. Mm-hmm. And you can Google a pretty funny looking picture of Aleister Crowley in a pharaoh type ritual headdress.
God.
Which I don't remember what the date was in that picture, but it probably would have been the early 20th century. So, you know, that's when occult groups kind of started getting interested in it after, you know, the Book of the Dead was made available, etc. There were, you know, some stories about Egyptian stuff being cursed. Though when I searched newspaper archives, I searched like the mummy's curse, mummy curse, etc. And stuff was not coming up, which was kind of disappointing to me because I was sort of hoping to find some weird alarmist Victorian stories about the mummy's curse.
Yeah.
But I found, like, mentioned in some article, someone had found an article from 1896 in the Hampshire Telegraph, so that would be in the UK. I guess I'll read this little bit. The mummy was that of a priest of Thetis, and it bore a mysterious inscription, which was long and blood-curdling. It set forth that whoever disturbed the body of this priest should himself be deprived of decent burial. He would be met with a violent death, and his mangled remains would be carried down by a rush of waters to the sea. The mummy was purchased by an adventurer named Herbert Ingram from the British consul in Luxor. Soon after, while hunting in Somalia, Ingram was trampled and attacked by an elephant. Yeah.
Wow.
I read on historyanswers.co.uk that by the time his companions were able to reach his remains days later, all but a handful of bones had been washed away by the rains.
Whoa.
So I'm sure there were more stories about, like, the mummy's curse, but they're kind of weirdly hard to find.
That's so strange, because that's, like, one of the... It seems like the whole mummy's curse, or, like, curse... Anyone who, like, steals from the tombs get cursed kind of thing seems like such a, like, known story in pop culture and in movies and TV shows. Like, I know Charmed did a whole episode about stuff like that.
Right.
And then, like, this... And then, obviously, in The Mummy and everything like that.
Yeah, there's this part of me that wonders if some of that was maybe early 20th century.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the 19th century was a big time of Egyptomania, but it was, you know, by no means the only time that Americans and Europeans were obsessed with Egypt. There was a big, you know, resurgence in interest in Egypt in the 1920s after Howard Carter discovered King Tut's tomb in 1922. And, you know, the story of King Tut definitely had, like, a big mummy's curse element to it.
Yeah, yeah.
Where, if I'm remembering right, I think it's like King Tut's mummy had a bug bite or something, or a mark on his cheek, and then Lord Carnarvon, who had funded the expedition, I think had somehow a similar, like, mark or bug bite on his cheek, and then he, like, died shortly after they found the mummy. I'm, like, probably remembering this, like, slightly off, since I'm remembering this off the top of my head. But definitely there was, like, a mummy's curse element to that. And so I wonder how much of the mummy's curse stuff was, like, there was obviously some idea of it, you know, in the 19th century. If there are at least this one article about it, I'm sure there are more. But maybe, like, it's, like, King Tut and movies and stuff that kind of furthered that idea. Also, interestingly, the 1920s had a big resurgence in interest in Egyptomania, or in Egypt, I guess, and then a big resurgence of interest in Ouija. So that, you know, makes sense to me, right? It's like right after World War I, people are interested in, for Ouija, they're interested in, like, communicating with the dead, potentially. Yeah. I'm sure people were feeling, like, pretty morbid and interested in Egypt.
Yeah.
And, you know, kind of like this disappeared civilization in the wake of World War One, and then also with like discoveries like King Tut's tomb. Of course, people are going to be interested. But next week, where I want to pick back up is the big, like the true Ouija mania of the 1920s and beyond. Because like kind of starting during World War One, like if we thought people were obsessed with Ouija before, they got really, really into it to the point that like at some points, in one case at least, the government had to step in. So we'll talk about that next week.
Cool.
But things get intense, Ouija-wise. Ouija-wise. But yeah, that's kind of like a quick bird's eye view of 19th century Egyptomania. There's obviously a ton more stuff to say about it, but that kind of gives you a sense of kind of what people were thinking about, what things they were obsessed with aside from Ouija, and kind of like what the context is in which this like Egyptian luck board became such a popular thing.
Yeah.
Wow.
I guess especially because like everyone is obsessed with Egypt, but obviously not everyone could get their hands on like an actual mummy. So,
right.
Like an Egyptian luck board was like the next best thing for their parlor games. Really.
Yeah. Well, especially if people were wearing like Egyptian jewelry and that kind of thing. It's kind of like all of a piece, right?
Yeah.
Like these modern things made to kind of suggest this connection to like the afterlife.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's like an Egyptian, something inspired by an Egyptian funerary, like necklace or something.
Mm-hmm. Or
a Ouija board saying that you can talk to the spirits or whatever.
Yeah.
You know. I mentioned this at the end of the last episode, but I'm sure this applies for this episode too. So I'm like recording standing up this time just because of like the closet I'm recording in here in North Carolina versus like the table I usually record at in New York. And I'm probably going to have to like change that because like last week my joints kept popping a lot.
Oh god.
Much like the fake wrappings of spirits and that fake spiritualists recreated with their joints or whatever. But this week too, I'm pretty sure there'll be some spirit wrapping sounds in the background. I was like, I'll try one more week. See, maybe last week my joints were just clickier than usual. But no. It's one of those things you don't really realize until you're recording.
Yeah.
And then you're like, man, like, do my joints really pop that much? Is that a problem? Who knows? Cool. Yeah. So we'll talk next week about some Ouija mania.
Sounds good.
Thanks for listening. You can find the show notes with all of the sources for this episode at buriedsecretspodcast.com. You can write to us at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. We especially are curious to hear if anybody has any fun Ouija stories. I'd love to hear those. You can follow us on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast.
And you can follow me on Instagram at Jen Marie Wild.
And we also have a Patreon at patreon.com/Buried Secrets. And we'll talk to you next week about Ouija Mania.
Yay!
Yay! Thanks for listening.